Welcome everyone to the first CITP invited lecture of this semester. I'm very pleased to welcome Amar Bhidé who's a professor of business at Columbia. He's educated at IIT and Harvard. He's worked at McKinsey and elsewhere, and he has a new book, The Venturesome Economy, which will be the basis for this talk, essentially telling us why our economy is actually successful in innovating.
Okay. Thank you. Pleasure to be here. It makes me nervous speaking to a bunch of engineers. Sort of the only people who don't like this stuff are engineers and scientists, but hopefully you'll be polite. So this is a book about innovation and globalization, and you may ask, why in God's name do you need yet another book on innovation and globalization? If you look at Amazon, there's some 60,000 books on globalization, an equal number on innovation. What could possibly be original? But it's a pretty original cover, I'd say. I mean, Benjamin Franklin goes shopping, Benjamin Franklin in a shopping bag. Maybe it's a subliminal trick, maybe to get you to buy the book and put it in your shopping bag. But I'm not responsible for the cover, sort of Princeton University Press, with Chuck Meyer sitting over there. But I am responsible for the content. And the content is different in the following way. It's an optimistic story about globalization. Now, of the 60,000 books about globalization, 30,000 of them are optimistic, 30,000 of them are pessimistic. So that in and of itself doesn't mean anything. But it's optimistic in two quite, I think, somewhat novel ways. One is that most people who are optimistic about globalization point to the export opportunities available to US companies like Intel and Microsoft to sell to growing markets in China and India. And they say we should be happy that China and India are growing because we can sell all our high-tech stuff there. I say maybe that's almost certainly true, but it's not as big a deal as its effect on activities that take place within the United States. So I'll be talking principally about the benefits to the domestic economy. The second point of difference with the usual sort of pro-globalization story, Thomas Friedman's, but not only Thomas Friedman's, is that the pro-globalists are often anti-protectionists. So they say trade barriers are awful, we should let globalization proceed. But if we are to survive the onslaught of competition from India and China, we have to stay ahead technologically. And our prosperity depends on maintaining our lead in high-end science and engineering, and so let's invest more, let's train more scientists and engineers, let's increase our funding for basic research, let's subsidize more R&D. I say this may not be as bad as protectionism, but this too has the potential to do more harm than good. That's the part which gets engineers and scientists annoyed. In the techno-nationalist view, the thesis is you lead or you lose. And it's and the magnitude, I mean, the extent of your prosperity depends on the magnitude of your lead. So if you win by 10 meters, if you win you have to win the gold medal in high tech and science, and it's not enough to win it by 1 meter. You're even, I mean, the medal is somehow bigger, and if you win it by 10 meters. So they sort of equate, like I said, prosperity with national leadership in high-level science and technology. And there's sort of any number of data points which they can throw at you. Our share of scientists, of PhDs in science and engineering has been declining. Our share of patents has been declining. Our share of cited scientific articles are declining, and so on and so forth. I mean, you've all probably encountered this kind of data. But here's the puzzle, which is if this sort of stuff has been going on for 25 years, and yet over the last 25 years, the US lead in productivity and per capita income, vis-a-vis those countries where our shares have been declining against, has not declined. It has arguably gone up. Now, it could be that 25 years is not long enough for the ill effects to show up. Or it could also be that there's something fundamentally wrong with the way these techno-nationalists look at the world. And I would argue that that techno-nationalists have the wrong model, that they are missing essential features of what, if Galbraith had been alive, would have called the modern technostructure. They're missing essential features of innovation and globalization. One crucial feature of modern reality is that the development and effective use of innovations requires multi-level, multifaceted advances. These slides are going to be kind of trivial, but important nonetheless. So what do I mean by that? Sort of take an artifact like a microprocessor. It is underpinned by several levels of knowledge. It is underpinned, obviously, by the laws of solid-state physics, which are perfectly general. But then it's also underpinned by several levels of know-how and knowledge which are more specific. So it's underpinned by the engineering that goes into into circuit design, and it's underpinned by the black art involved with the management of a specific fabrication plant. It's multifaceted in the sense that new technologies also have to be complemented by new sales and marketing practices. It is not true that new products, because they're great, sell themselves. You need a sales pitch and you need a marketing pitch, and this is also an important part of the process. I was once at an NBR seminar where this very distinguished developmental economist had tried to figure out why African farmers did not use fertilizer. And she'd done these really carefully controlled randomized experiments and manipulating incentives and information. And at the end of it, she came to the conclusion that they couldn't figure out why African farmers did not use fertilizer. So I went to her afterwards and said, by the way, did you go and study agricultural practices in other countries such as India, which also have illiterate farmers, but where they did start using fertilizer? Oh no, we don't do that. That's not a randomized experiment. So I said, well, maybe you might have discovered, if you'd done that, that there were salespeople involved in selling the fertilizer. That farmers do not, I mean, people don't just start using stuff. You need sales and marketing for the stuff to be put into use. And new technologies also require often new business models, new business model innovations. So going back to a really historical example, the technology behind the railroad itself was not sufficient to transform the American industry. For the railroads to be put into effective use, you literally had to invent techniques of modern management. The line and staff functions, a whole bunch of bookkeeping and control functions were all invented around the 1850s through the 1870s to make the railroads function. And virtually not most modern technologies also have this character, which is that to have them put into effective use, you need to change a whole bunch of business models around it. All this seems utterly trivial. Why do I emphasize this? I emphasize this because in the view of the techno-nationalists, they only think of the highest levels of scientific and engineering knowledge, and they ignore all this other stuff. And it's the composite of all these different kinds of know-how, both technical and non-technical, which are necessary for economic progress to take place. So if one takes these kinds of the realities of the modern technostructure into account, it becomes pretty obvious why the loss of share of high-level science and engineering has not done any harm over the last 25 years and is unlikely to do any harm in the next 25 years. In the first instance, the value appropriated by innovators tends to be really small. Consumers tend to capture 95 or plus % of the value of most innovations. If one is thinking of high advances in high-level science, scientists capture 0% of the economic value because the stuff is given away. Not only that, it is no longer true, as it may once have been, that places where technological advances take place are also where the downstream jobs are located. May have once been a time when Detroit was the home of all sort of new automotive technologies, and Detroit was also then the place where most automotive jobs were. But that process has stopped for about 30 years. So wherever breakthroughs take place are not necessarily the place where the jobs are located. I gave this talk in London, and there's an angry gentleman who stood up and said, "But you know, haven't you noticed that the Japanese were at the forefront of automotive technology, and they've eaten American automobile companies for lunch?" So I said, but wait a minute. Think of who has captured the value of these advances in automotive technologies. Most of it has gone to buyers of automobiles, not to the producers of automobiles. So most of it has been captured by people who buy fantastic Japanese cars. And I said, increasingly, most of sort of the benefits that accrue to the workforce now accrue in the United States, because the great advances that may have taken place in Japan are now being put into use in automobile plants located in America. So you may say that American companies have gotten hammered, but you cannot say that because of Japanese advances, the American economy, either on the production side or on the consumption side, has taken a huge hit. The fact is that great high-level research does not necessarily generate much domestic value added. So allegedly, Rochester is the city in the United States with the highest per capita patents in the country because of the University of Rochester and Xerox and Kodak. Rochester is not economically the most vibrant state in the country. Once upon a time, Massachusetts dominated the computer industry, at least during the mini-computer era. Massachusetts was not a prosperous state at the time. So there is no necessary nexus between having either great high-level science or even advanced technology and widespread prosperity. But I'm making a stronger argument than that. I'm not merely saying don't worry about the loss of our share of high-level science and engineering. I say be happy. And don't worry isn't the same thing as be happy. So why do I claim that it's a good thing for us if our share declines because the output of science and engineering in places like China and India increases? Here one gets into more subtle features of the technostructure. One is that high-level know-how tends to be more mobile than lower levels of know-how. So Archimedes' principle was incredibly easily transportable. It may have started in Greece, but the benefit of Archimedes' principle sort of is available to all. But as you get lower down in that chain, the art of shipbuilding is much less transportable. So the transistor principle, to give you a modern example, is again perfectly globally mobile. The art of running a semiconductor plant is much less so. And this tends to be for two reasons. One is that the high-level scientific and technological breakthroughs can be captured in algorithms and can be precisely stated. As you get to lower levels of know-how, the knowledge tends to be more tacit. Secondly, as you get to lower levels of know-how, the stuff tends to be more rooted in time and place. And therefore, even if you can transmit it, it does not have much value in the place other than where it is generated. So what the increased supply of high-level research produced in China and India basically will provide more raw material for lower-level innovations, regardless of where these innovators might be located. This will in turn encourage the domestic innovators in the US and places like Europe to exploit their comparative advantage in lower-level innovations. And again, these lower-level innovations have to be locally deployed and developed. Yes, sir.
It's all relative, right?
Can you? I'll be done, and then there's a fairly complex argument. So. And this will in turn increase the domestic consumer surplus. But you may say, what about the wages and productivity of the workforce? Didn't I just say that sort of the place where innovations take place are not necessarily the place where things are produced, where the jobs are found? this is not of practical great concern because of the growth of the service economy. It is not true that everything is becoming more globally traded. What we in fact see are two offsetting trends. On the one side, there is more trading of tradables. Certainly, I mean, the stuff that you can drop on your shoe is being globally produced and is being globally traded. But we also see an offsetting trend, which is that the service sector, which is largely untraded, is becoming a larger and larger share of the domestic economy. And it's innovations in this service sector which are absolutely crucial to widespread prosperity. And these innovations have to be locally produced and locally deployed, because you cannot have widespread prosperity unless the average productivity of the workforce goes up. If most of your workforce is employed in services, having that productivity go up is absolutely crucial. But these innovations have to be well adapted for local conditions. So if you have an innovation that improves the productivity of the retailing sector, that has to be more or less well adapted to US retailing practices, and of course it has to be locally deployed. So then the question is, why should innovators invest in localization and development for mature economies? Why not why don't all innovators rush off to China and India, which are growing at, or at least until last month, were growing in double digits, whereas we grow, because we're a mature economy, at 2 or 3% a year. And here we get into a third crucial feature of the modern economy, which is frequently not well appreciated in economic models and in policy discourse. And this is what I call venturesome consumption. The assumption in most economic models is that consumers are simply passive, undeserving beneficiaries of innovations. And this is a quote from Paul Romer, where he says, "Innovators have brought the cost of a transistor down to less than a millionth of its former level. Yet most of the benefits from these discoveries have been reaped not by the innovating firms, but by the users of transistors. In 1985, I paid $1,000 per million transistors for memory in my computer. In 2005, I paid less than $10 per million. Yet I did nothing to deserve or help pay for this windfall." I think the part of the statement till you get to the italics is absolutely right. There is no doubt that the users of transistors have captured most of the value. This is what I take serious issue with. And I take issue with for the following reasons. The reality is that users play a critical venturesome role in the development and use of technological innovations. In many cases, as I found in my research, they play a co-development role through engaging in a dialogue with the developer. But you may say, oh, these are just a few leading edge users. What about the rest of us? And I say that even the rest of us play a crucial role in two important ways. One is that we bear a lot of night and uncertainty. We bear a lot of risk. What do I mean by that? In economic models, the assumption is that we all have well-defined utility functions. And then whenever we buy something, we consult our utility function and we see if the utility we're going to get from it is more or less than the price of the object that we're going to buy. If it's more than we buy, I would submit that most of us don't have a clue what our utility functions are. I'd submit that most of you who have bought flat panel TVs had no idea, either before or after the fact, whether the economic value of that flat panel TV, what the economic value of that flat panel TV was. Whether or not you are a leading edge user, by the way. So it's not just whether you're a leading edge user. We at Columbia just invested in a new intranet. And we sort of did the usual stuff. We had a committee that got RFPs. We studied the thing up the kazoo. We had no idea either before or after we bought this whether the value that we have derived is greater than the cost. We actually don't even have a good handle on the cost. The fact is we just do it. We take a chance that this thing will provide us with more benefit than the cost. I bought my first computer in 1982, was it? It was an IBM XT. I think I paid $10,000 for it, which is about a fourth of my salary. And over the years, I must have bought sort of 6 or 7 computers. I have no idea whether these things that I bought have been worth the value, worth the price or not. And it's not just me, it's sort of 100 million people, all of us who have been taking this kind of risk. And I would say that if you added up these risks, they far exceed the risks taken by the producers of computers. And it's not just risk-taking, it's also resourceful problem solving. Not only did I pay $10,000 for my first computer and sort of possibly, maybe close to $100,000 for my hardware or software after that, I've also spent an awful lot of time making these things work. I may be stupid, but for me, my computers, my hardware and software does not work out of the box. And it's not just a matter of the fact that instructions are not well specified and in fact cannot be well specified for a complex artifact. It's also that I have to tailor the hardware and software to my use. So I'm engaged in pretty much the same way as the developers of the hardware software are engaged in resourceful problem solving. And again, if you add up all the effort that we, the users of computers, have put in, it probably swamps the man-hours that have been put in by the producers of hardware and software. And if it hadn't been for us, there would be no computer revolution. Because it's our venturesomeness that stimulates innovations, that Intel and Microsoft, etc., invest in new products and services because they know that there are us waiting to buy it. And even if they did do this, the stuff would be economically useless unless we were willing to make the investment to use it. And so in my view, the US economy is winning by using. There are people who say once upon a time in a golden age in the early 80s, the US had a trade surplus in advanced technology products. We now have a deficit. How horrible is that? I argue that this increasing trade deficit in advanced technology products is a symbol of our strength, not our weakness. As the use of computers has become more broadly diffused through the economy, the trade deficit has gone up because the stuff physically gets made in China. When Steve Jobs invents the iPod and the iPhone, it increases our trade deficit because the stuff gets made in China. But I think most of us would agree that it's probably a good thing that Steve Jobs does go on and produce iPods and iPhones. And the reason is because the production of IT, even if you take sort of the broadest view of it, accounts for less than 10% of US GDP, but it has a profound influence on the other sectors that use the other 90% of the economy that uses IT. And the principal source of the US productivity edge vis-a-vis those places which are allegedly sort of catching up on us in terms of high tech and PhDs and scientific citations is that we make more and better use of IT in our service sector. That's the principal source of our advantage. A similar comparison can be found if we compare Norway versus Japan. The US is the #1 country in the world in terms of productivity per worker, but part of that is because we work an awful number of hours. If you scale productivity by number of hours worked, we drop to #3. #1 is Norway. Yet Norway is not a powerhouse of technological innovation at all. By most measures, it's pretty much of a middling or a lagging country. It doesn't produce a lot of patents. It does not have a Karolinska Institute as Sweden does. It has no Nokia or Ericsson like Finland and Norway do. And yet it's the #1 country in the world in terms of productivity per hour. Now, I should emphasize where I'm talking about productivity per hour, not per capita income, because per capita income could be accounted for by the oil. Productivity per hour cannot be accounted for by the oil. And so the Norwegian central bank sort of looked into why Norway had such high labor productivity, and their conclusion was it was because Norway made fantastic use of IT, even though it didn't actually produce IT, in its services sector. Particularly, Japan, in contrast, is sort of a technological powerhouse, produces lots of patents, great technological breakthroughs, and so on and so forth. But its economy has been in a slump for the last 10 years. And one possible reason for this is that although the manufacturing sector is fantastic and they produce all these great electronic gizmos, the service sector is horrible. And even the service functions within companies like Honda and Toyota, which have fantastic factories, are awful. But if half of or more of your workforce is going to be engaged in services, and that sector is awful for a variety of reasons, your overall productivity isn't going to be great and your overall economic performance isn't going to be great. Once someone in the audience pointed to the example of Israel, said, Israel is a great country for producing high tech, has fantastic success stories of high tech companies that have shown up on NASDAQ. Yet per capita incomes in Israel are below that of Greece and Slovenia. And so his explanation was because it was because Israel's high tech companies don't become Nokias. I think that's not true because neither Greece nor Slovenia have Nokias either. I think the problem is that there's a large proportion of people in the Israeli workforce who, by definition, don't work for high tech but work in a whole bunch of the service industry in Israel. And for a variety of reasons, the productivity in those sectors is really low. So you can have all the high tech stuff you want, but if a large proportion of your workforce is not working in a productively, then you're not going to get very far. Well, what if these service sector jobs go away? We have your colleague Alan Blinder, who tells us that some 30 million service sector jobs are poised, ready to go off to India and China. And these include not just call center people, but radiologists and journalists and, heaven forfend, business school professors. So am I concerned about this? Not really. And the reason is for yet another sort of a feature of the modern economy, which I call non-destructive creation. Schumpeter gave us this incredibly powerful phrase, creative destruction, and he sort of said it's the essence of a progressive capitalist economy, so that the automobile has to destroy the stagecoach for the world to advance. And I think he was half right. Creative destruction does indeed play an important role in economic progress, but it's only half. The other half of it is that there's at least as much non-destructive creation as there is destructive as there's destructive creation. So the automobile may have destroyed the stagecoach, but airplanes did not destroy the automobile. The calculator may have destroyed the slide rule, but personal computers did not, in point of fact, really eat into mainframe MIPS, although I'm speaking in front of a computer system. Mobile phones, only now, after some 30 years after they're being used, are beginning to eat into landlines. There are more landlines being used. Most medical advances are examples of non-destructive creation. They usually sort of cure diseases that were not previously cured. And this, I believe, is an essential feature of modern economic progress. Because if all you had was creative destruction, the process would grind to a stop. And then the other interesting feature of this non-destructive creation is that new products, even if they're manufactured offshore, tend to generate a lot of service sector employment onshore. During the course of writing this book, I tried to go back into history to see when it last was that manufacturing employment in the US exceeded service sector employment. And the answer was it was never. So in 1720, manufacturing and services both had roughly the same share, at least according to the numbers that I was able to find, had identical shares of employment. And since and agriculture obviously had the largest. Since then, the share of agriculture went down and both manufacturing and services went up. But services tended to go up consistently faster than manufacturing. And I think one reason for this is that as the range of products that we consumed increased, not only did this create manufacturing jobs, this created a multiple of service sector jobs. Sort of a striking example of this would be the airplane industry. So the invention of the airplane not only created jobs for people building airplanes, it created a very large number of jobs for people flying these airplanes, for people who work at airports, for travel agents. I mean, there are, I think, about 10 times as many people associated with the airline industry as there are people who manufacture airplanes. And so as long as this So regardless of where this new stuff is produced, so even if the iPod is produced in China, a whole bunch of related service sector jobs exist in the US. And so what this does, this process as a whole tends to offset losses due to creative destruction and offshoring. So 30 years ago at Columbia, we had a typing pool and we had payroll clerks. The typing pool has been lost to creative destruction. We guys do our own typing. The payroll clerks have been outsourced. But yet today there are more non-teaching staff at Columbia is larger than what it used to be, because we've created a whole bunch of new jobs. We now have bloggers on our staff. We have people who do web design. We have intranets. When I first started teaching, we didn't do the stuff. We used transparencies. And behind the stuff, we now have a staff of people who maintain it. So it may be the case that some of our X-rays will start being read in India, and to that degree, radiologist jobs will be threatened. But look what's happened to diagnostic technologies in the last 10 years. We now have PET scans, and we now have MRIs. This is, again, examples of non-destructive creation. And with each of these new technologies, we have a whole bunch of service sector jobs, both for radiologists and technicians and the people who sell and install this stuff, all in the US. So to say that 30 million jobs are vulnerable, sort of, so what? I mean, in the natural course, a lot of these jobs will turn over, but unless this process comes to a halt, we can be reasonably confident that we are, in fact, more likely to face a labor shortage 10 years from now, rather than a labor surplus in these fields. Okay, so let me get to the policy implications of this. Could techno-nationalism be the right policy for the wrong reasons? Could this be sort of the Sputnik effect? There was really no missile gap, but because of the fear of this missile gap, we invested heavily in science and technology. And maybe there's really nothing to be afraid of from China and India. Maybe it's a good thing. But if this gets us to invest more in science and technology, this would be a good thing. There is no doubt in my mind, my objection to this view is not a libertarian rant. There is no doubt in my mind that technology increases the optimal role of government. When you invent automobiles, you need traffic cops. When we have cyberspace, you have cyber crime, and you need cyber cops. With most new technologies, you need a larger demand for public goods. So if you had automobiles, you needed a highway system, and you invented airplanes, you needed air traffic control. So I have no quarrel with an increased provision of public goods. But the question is, ever more of a good thing doesn't necessarily make it great. So sort of the demand for a national highway system, which is probably a good thing, also led to bridges to nowhere. So we have to sort of look at the data specifically and say, is the public good that the techno-nationalists claim we should invest more in? Is there any actual real evidence of undersupply? And national academies of sciences and engineering, etc., produce this 500-page tome called The Gathering Storm. And this is the case they make for, they make a whole bunch of other cases as well, but let me just focus for a minute on the argument for subsidizing R&D. So this is what they claim. They say there are 8 studies showing that the public returns from R&D are less than private returns. And sort of any self-respecting economist would therefore jump to the conclusion that therefore we must subsidize this activity so that because there's going to be an undersupply of R&D. But wait a minute. All that these regressions do is tell us, under a whole bunch of assumptions, what had happened. So historically, it may have been the case that the private returns were greater than were less than the public returns. It doesn't tell us what would have happened if we had in fact subsidized R&D. So it isn't always the case that that increasing financial incentives elicits more effort. So I'm perfectly prepared to believe that the prize money that Roger Federer and Rafael Nadal got at Wimbledon was, their private return was well below the public good that they created, people like me who enjoyed it. I don't think that they would have played any harder in last year's Wimbledon if prize money had been doubled. Now you may say, well, but I mean, I'm using a sort of glib example. You can always add more people. It isn't always true that more effort leads to better results. So Big Pharma has written off sort of $5 to $10 billion of R&D over the last 5 or 10 years. It has nothing to do with the effort put into it. They didn't have good targets, and they didn't have good good compounds to hit those targets with. The automobile industry has probably written off $100 billion of R&D in the last 10 years. So who's to say that if R&D had been subsidized, that all of it would have increased good R&D and not the bad R&D? We just don't know. I mean, looking at these ex post regression analyses don't tell us this. Also, these kinds of studies ignore the role of low-level technology and these complementary marketing and managerial know-how. In many cases, these are the potential bottlenecks. I would submit to you that the problem with the U.S. healthcare system does not derive from our inadequate knowledge of genomics, that it derives from badly run hospitals and a perverse insurance systems. That solving these bottlenecks also requires investments. And these investments also generate spillovers. I gave you the example of the railroad industry. The investments that the railroads made to figure out how to manage a modern enterprise were of value to the world at large, not just to the railroad companies that produce them. So they were exactly like scientific and technological breakthroughs. I would think that one of the huge contributions that IBM has made to the modern world is through the development of its marketing and sales processes. This, thanks to Thomas Watson in the 1940s, this not only helped IBM dominate its markets, it also helped users of IBM's computers derive more value from these computers, and it was a spillover to the degree that almost every high-tech company in the world today, in some way, shape, or form, uses the IBM process to sell computers. And if they aren't sold, they wouldn't be used, and there would be there'd be no consumer surplus from this. Likewise, let's take the argument for training more scientists and engineers. And this is, again, back to Romer's argument. He says scientists and engineers are the basic input in the discovery process, the fuel that fires the innovation engine. The US, he says, lags in the fraction of 24-year-olds who receive science and engineering degrees, and therefore he proposes a $1 billion program to provide 50,000 fellowships for graduate work in the natural sciences and engineering. So what does this mean? Implicit in this argument is that there's some kind of market failure. And it also suggests that these 50,000 people are doing something that is of less social value than if they became scientists and engineers. And is there really a market failure in the labor market? The share of managerial and professional jobs has doubled since the 1940s, gone from 1 in 6 to 1 in 3. It is highly unlikely that this doubling has taken place because of a spontaneous increase in the bureaucratization of American companies. I mean, if anything, over the last 20 years, we have seen vast efforts to downsize, to re-engineer and all that stuff. My hunch is that it's because we've become a progressively more of a service sector economy, and that this service sector economy requires a higher ratios of managerial to technical personnel than did a manufacturing-oriented economy. Or there's a study by Bresnahan and Greenstein on the adoption of client-server technology. And what they show is that client-server technology did not take off to the degree that it had been expected by people to take off, not because of the technological limitations of client-server technology, but because of the difficulty of adapting business processes and organizational structures to take advantage of this client-server technology. But what would happen? Yeah?
What is an understanding of client-server technology?
The use of your basic sort of client servers as opposed to mainframes.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. So the expectation was that client server would sort of wipe out mainframes, and it didn't happen. And they sort of systematically looked at the use of client servers as a substitute for mainframes, and and said, and then they tried to figure out where it was more and where it was less, and they found where it was less was where the organizational problems. But solving these kinds of problems requires more people who are organizational people, who are managerial people, not more engineers. And so, what would the impact of the Roma of the Roma proposal be? Well, it would lead to fewer people available to solve these problems and more people to advance client-server technology. So, like I said, I have no quarrel with the state providing good public goods. I think it's incredibly hard to know what the right level of public subsidy to science should be, or to high tech should be. Sort of, all I'm saying is whatever that level is cannot be more because China and India are producing more science and high tech. Because if you think of this multi-level game, if there's a supply shock and if there's a sudden and unexpected increase in the level of high level science and technology being produced from a part of the world which did not produce it before, this common sense suggests that the bottleneck then will move to lower levels. So the growth of the catch up of India and China reduce the congruence of subsidizing R&D but not marketing. It reduces the argument for training more engineers if China and India and Korea start producing a vast surplus of engineers. It sort of makes less sense for us to do it ourselves. So let me leave you with two concluding thoughts about modern prosperity. One is that widespread prosperity requires widespread productivity improvements. This requires both the development and use of innovative technologies. This requires both innovative consumers as well as innovative developers. And this is a massively multiplayer game. It's not a spectator sport, so we cannot delegate this stuff to a few people in the NFL who for millions of dollars will sort of bash their skulls against each other. We all have to be involved. And the second important thought I'd leave you with is that it's not a zero-sum game. This is what Adam Smith said in 1779. He said, should the industry of Ireland, in consequence of freedom and good government, ever equal that of England, so much the better it would be for England. As the wealth and industry of Lancashire does not obstruct but promote that of Yorkshire, so the wealth and industry of Ireland would not obstruct but promote that of England. So I'd update this to say that if should the technological and scientific capabilities of China and India ever equal that of the US, so much the better it would be for the US, and it's kind of nuts to say that we have to stay, quote unquote, stay ahead in order for us to prosper. Now I'll be happy to.
So let's take questions, and per tradition, let's see if we can get the first question from a student. Students? Jen, thanks.
So why do you think different service sectors in different countries differ so much in how they use IT?
I think you really have to look at it sector by sector by sector. In Germany, for instance, the low use of IT, and Japan, I suspect, is policies that favor the small retailers. And so the regulatory climate is quite hostile to Walmart kinds of enterprises. And small retailers sort of cannot afford nor have the capacity to acquire IT on the scale that US retailers do. And in healthcare, I think the US is to some degree quite backwards in the use of IT. And this may have something to do with the way our insurance system is organized. So I don't think there's a simple sort of blanket answer. But it so happens that in the aggregate, the US spends more, much more, scale per GDP, by the way, than most countries in the world. And the reason we spend more is not because we just are spendthrifts, but we have figured out ways to take advantage of it more. And it's become sort of like a virtuous cycle. So this also means then that US companies develop the managerial know-how to take advantage of IT. So there's an interesting paper by Nick Sadum and somebody else. They looked at three kinds of companies based in the UK. US branches of US multinationals, branches of non-US multinationals, and domestic British companies. And they found that the branches of US multinationals spent more on IT, especially in the service sectors, and they derived more value from IT, which kind of makes sense. You spend more if you get more value from it. So part of it may have to do with the way US companies are organized, a whole bunch of possible reasons.
So you had a slide that talked about how these lower level implementation problems were less movable, like how to manage a factory is less movable than these high level ideas. But it seems like if any idea is actually, if it's able to sort of help an economy locally, that would be transferable outside the country to, like why is a basic business practice, why is that specifically less movable than sort of?
So
I mean, are you arguing that these can move around inside the country but not outside? Or
I think the further away you go from the place where it was developed, the greater the chance of incongruence with local customs and tastes are. So we've seen this in retailing. So the idea of a category killer, like Home Depot, that you can think of that as sort of the highest level of knowledge, right? That is reasonably transferable, and there are. But when people who have tried to take their overall business model from one country to another, it generally hasn't worked. So Walmart has not been particularly successful in Germany, and in fact had to shut down its German operations. Because a whole bunch of things, whereas Aldi in Germany has a deep, long experience of how to run a high-volume discount shop in Walmart. People have tried to develop sort of hospital management software on a global basis. So Siemens at some point had this thing where it just doesn't work. So Java is a perfectly sort of global product. But once you start getting down to the level of designing hospital management software, it really has to be tied to local insurance policies and how doctors in a particular country operate and so forth. Yes, sir?
Is it not movable? Is it because of the knowledge barrier there, or is it just because it's not portable in the sense of being usable in a different context because of societal issues, policy issues, and so on? Because I would figure that the low level of barrier to entry in terms of the knowledge there is not that high. So somebody smart group of people should be able to make it happen elsewhere. The only reason why it may not be portable is because it's a different societal context, it's a different political context, and therefore what works in SpaceX doesn't work.
There are two reasons for the barriers. One is that a lot of the knowledge is tacit, the lower level knowledge. It cannot actually be fully written down. And the second is that quite apart from, I think Intel has this program called Copy Exactly, right? Have you heard of this? They couldn't quite figure out how the heck to make semiconductor plants get good yield from one place to the next. And so they said, down to the color of the paint in the plants. We don't know why the color of paint matters or not. But we're going to try to precisely reconstruct this. And this again, there are subtle changes in local conditions. Carl Polanyi has this one line where he says he's seen two glass-making plants, exactly the same equipment. One plant in one country where it originated working perfectly, and in another country simply not functioning. I happened to observe this at close range. My father bought my father had a glass factory, and his stuff was mouth blown, and so he bought himself a fancy turnkey plant from a Japanese company. They came over to India, sort of tried to recreate the thing exactly. Simply did not work. I mean, they brought the engineers over, and you think glass is glass is glass, and God knows why. And it eventually had to be shut down. Vinod Khosla has this interesting story. But I wrote a case about Sun Microsystems once, where the original Sun technology had been licensed by Andy Bechtolsheim to all takers for $10,000. And one of the reasons why Andy decided to join up with Vinod, at least according to Vinod in the case that I written, that people, even after getting these blueprints, simply could not produce a workstation in the manner in which Andy thought it should be done. And at some point, Sun had licensed its technology to computer vision. Computer vision couldn't get it done. So, so the barriers to transfer are not just across countries; they can be within the same country as well. But they become even more intense when the conditions we're going across become different.
Just your insights about the idea that the bottlenecks are typically not high technology so much as these sorts of managerial and local issues. Do those have any implications for patent policy in terms of does that mean, for example, that less patent protection, the optimal amount of patent protection might be reduced?
Okay. So first of all, let me say that I'm not saying that in all cases the bottlenecks are always at mid to low level. So I would imagine that perhaps a bottleneck in the treatment of cancer is some fundamental understanding of what causes cancer. So let me not. I'm just saying that the bottlenecks vary a great deal at different parts of the economy at different points in time, and then therefore one should not obsess just about the potential bottleneck at the top. My instincts are that too liberal a patent policy is incongruent with the way the economy is evolving, but it's kind of hard to prove the counterfactual in the sense that most of the companies that I studied, which were these mid-level innovators, venture capital back guys, for most of them, dealing with patents was a complete pain in the neck because they were building these things like enterprise software, where they're taking hundreds of components from here or there, and the fear that they may be in patent violating somebody's patent somewhere was a nuisance, and then this would lead them to accumulate a patent portfolio as a defensive weapon in case they got sued, etc., etc. So it seems perverse. On the other hand, if someone said to me, well, if we didn't have strong patent protection, the upstream stuff would not get produced at all, and then where would we be? I don't have an a priori answer to that. So I tend to be very sympathetic to the idea that we give away patents too freely, and it's hurting innovation at these mid to low level. Mid to low level innovations by themselves are very difficult to patent because many of them are not non-obvious to the degree that they involve tacit knowledge. You can't write them down. So I think an awful lot of mid-level innovation would take place. So the need to provide incentives to encourage mid-level innovations, I think are really small in most cases. But if you said, well, there would be no mid-level innovations without the high-level innovations, and we need to have some of those, then I would really have no strong answer to that, except I'd disagree with you.
Let's adjourn to informal discussion upstairs, 2 floors up from here with excellent food and drink. Also, a reminder, next week we have another talk in the same time slot. Richard Sarnoff, who's the chair of the American Association of Publishers, will be talking about the Google Books settlement and its implications for the future of publishing. But next week, The reception is before the talk at 3:30. Excellent food and drink 2 floors up at 3:30 next week, and then the talk at 4:30. So let's head up.
You'll have a much more, if you